Who was the creepiest person you've ever seen or met? I knew a guy who was involved with a very large well-known me. He was enormous, looked scary as hell, but was the nicest guy ever. He had vanished for a couple of years, which wasn't uncommon. Normally he would let people know he was back around, but he showed up one evening and wanted to hang out, have a couple of drinks, maybe smoke a few bowls. He was acting somewhat normal, but there was the weird vibe he was throwing off. He kept asking if we had talked to so-and-so or this or that person lately. Then he started asking if the kids were home in bed sleeping. It really got creepy and strange. We kept hinting it was time for us to go to bed. It was getting late, but he just wouldn't leave. Eventually, we said, "You gotta go." Man, turned out he was really fresh of a crime scene, took out a very important person and had all the tools and everything in his truck outside. When I was in 5th grade, I met a guy at my school that was in high school, presumably a sophomore, as he graduated when I was in 7th grade. He was the stereotypical neckbeard fat guy that was a furry. He absolutely adored books and was seen as the weird guy. For context, I was an aspiring artist and I drew a lot of furry artwork, and I had drawn on the cover of my notebook. He saw it and asked to see it with me, being there. Little shy artist. I let him see it, he complimented it, and then all hell broke loose when I was in 6th grade. He got friendlier with me. He would lean onto my seat at the bus and touch me on my thighs. He would be sometimes make crude jokes and would be very annoying, though I tolerated him because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. Though it got to the point where he began showing me furry porn on his tablet that he brought to school, and he would give me candy and money. It got to the point where my friends found out and urged me to make he leave me alone, but I was being too nice and just let me keep bothering me. The principal soon acknowledged the issue and gave him a talking to, which did nothing, and he continued to harass me, though I soon began ignoring him, which left a sour taste in his mouth. But he didn't press on, though. When I hit 7th grade, he followed me around campus and bought me things, but he would touch me and make crude and sexually themed jokes, though he graduated that year. But it didn't stop. One day this guy showed up at my house. He knocked on the door and my dad let him in, which freaked us both out. He just stood there and looked at me up and down before we exchanged the laws, and he just left. It was very extradition. When I was 13, I used to pick up my girlfriend at her home so we could walk to school together, and she lived close to a rough neighborhood. I lived close by, but she lived closer, and one day when I was going, a guy like 19 years old, kind of pretty, actually stopped me. He was deaf and mute and seemed okay at first. He used his phone to communicate with me and said he needed help to carry some stuff, and naive as I was, I followed him inside his house. There was another guy there who greeted me. He was also deaf and he was really lifting something, but we didn't stop to help him. And first the guy took me to his room and started to write to talk to me. I thought it was weird at the time, but wasn't concerned, as he asked some superficial personal stuff until he said that I was pretty mean. Danger sign finally kicked off and I rushed to the room's door, but he had locked it, and for the most terrifying 1 to 2 minutes of my life, he tried to pull me softly from the door while I was panicking. That's when I finally remembered he was deaf, and instead of speaking, signaled to him that I wanted to leave, pointing to me and then to the outside direction repeatedly. He seemed to understand and let me leave, and I then went to school a little shook. I never told this to anyone but my girlfriend, and although at the time I thought that he wanted to molest me, which is still possible, I think it is more likely that he just had some mental disease and wanted to make friends. Otherwise, I was helpless and he could have just blocked me. I think I still have some difficulty to deal with disabled people in general because of that. A little thought I'm working to improve on that. Almost 20 years ago, my husband and I heard that the Presidio in San Francisco had opened for camping. My mom grew up there, so we decided to go. We set up our tent during the day, then went into town. We came back at night when it was dark. On the path to our tent, just after the parking lot, there was the guy sitting by a fire. We were friendly and said hello, etc. He just stared silently back at us. I had the worst feeling I've ever had. I told my husband how I felt, and he said it was fine. I was just scared, no big deal, but I wasn't just scared. I had an intense feeling that we needed to leave immediately, so we got to the tent, and my protective husband was still trying to make me feel better. We're religious, so he suggested we say a prayer, and that would make us feel better. Halfway through the prayer, I had the words "run now" in my head. My husband stopped in the middle of his prayer and said, "I feel it too. We need to run now." We bowled out of the tent and go running through the woods. Since we couldn't go back the way we had come, we came out to a road and flagged a car down and asked them to follow us as we walked around back to our car so we would have their lights and someone with us when we got there. The guy was gone, remember. His fire had been right by the parking lot. We went to a hotel that night, and the next day when we came back to get our tent, we could tell he'd been in it. Listen to your instincts, people. Yes, I have met him today personally. He lives in Layer Vicar, New Delhi, India. I'm not a rude person, but this 70 years old man whom I met was totally creepy and suffering from some a phobia, maybe half a phobia of not letting outsiders touch his things. So I was at his son's place, who is also a maniac who looks geeky but was a total idiot for selling my bike. When we were discussing, this old fellow came to me and started asking about my background after knowing that I'm a computer science engineer. He brings out his power bank, which is not indicating the charging signal. Every Indian will bring gadgets, electronic items for repairing when they find out that they're the guy sitting next to them is used anyway. As I was charging my phone using my power bank, so I asked Uncle happily to give me the power bank so that I can have a look. Yes, trying to be the nice guy. That was the time I realized that this man will not hand over his thing to me. I couldn't understand what just happened, so I told him to charge it first. If it starts blinking, then it will be okay after half an hour. His son has already screwed the deal off my bike by negotiating the price to N7 be my senior and elder to me. I control my grudge inside, as I had already wasted my the whole day. Then again, that uncle arrives from nowhere with his old Samsung phone and flashed it towards me from a distance of 10 to 15 meters. That the WhatsApp messenger app on his mobile is not working. I was shocked that this guy constantly wants me to have a look at his devices, but was adamant about not letting me touch them. When I tried to take the phone to check the situation, the way he nodded and moved backward was creepy as hell. To my utter shock, his son didn't react to this at all. Maybe he's used to this. He was constantly smiling like a wicket, so the uncle decided to keep his gadgets at a distance from me, but wanted a solution for their faults as well. No way, dude. I stood up, greeted both of them, and left. I don't care if you both, father and son, is reading this. You both are, and real jerks, and behaves with guests like people who lived in the 19th century with a narrow mind. Dude grows up. You're in the 21st century, not me, but my dad. My dad works with multiple problem families, but used to work in a children's mental hospital as sort of mentor. He told me once about an 8-year or so old kid who was a psychopath. He saw him get kicked between the legs and not move a muscle. The scary moment. He had an argument with this one kid about something trivial. My dad wasn't around, but heard screams and ran over. This kid had tied the other one to a tree and set him on fire. He was just looking at the other kid. My dad helped put out the fire and made sure they never saw each other again. Luckily, they were on time and the kid got away with only small burn marks. One of the few stories my dad dared to tell me. This story gets creepier as it goes on. Bear with me. I've always been the kind of a person who sympathizes with the reserved kid, sitting alone in corners, as I was one myself. So being in a classroom seat neighboring one of these shy guys, I decided to try and make an acquaintance with him. While he scribbled comics into a notebook, I complimented his piece and did not realize what an effect it had on him until the next class. During a trigonometry test, he scratched something onto a scrap sheet and slid it to the corner of his table. At first, I thought he might have been requesting some answers, but at second glance I could see the bold arrow pointing towards me. I like you a lot, it said. I chuckled and shrugged it off, to which he responded by adding, I really mean it. I've never rejected anyone. So I had no clue how to respond to him when the bell rang and decided I needed more time to think it out. Now, not to be rude, but this poor kid was the exact opposite of my type, a scrawny little white boy with an afro and the personality of a rock. That's not to say I think he deserves to be alone, but I knew that I didn't want to be the one to keep him company when I caught him drawing me to the next class while I was asleep, and the class after that. Yet don't expect me to stay alert through a 2-hour trick class anyway. He handed me the second drawing and asked if I'd eat lunch with him. I somehow managed to stammer out an excuse both times he asked and began to avoid him from then on, but apparently the class knew he liked me and thought I may have had feelings for him, as I was the only one to treat him with kindness. It wasn't a surprise when during an educational film, the desks all happened to shift away from this kid, and now while I was in the bathroom I had to listen to him telling me about his dogs and game developing skills for 2 hours. It was the most talkative he'd ever been, so I felt a bit guilty. On my way outside of the school that day, he came up to me and talked to me about his suicidal tendencies for about 40 minutes while my mom waited for me to come outside. Obviously, I visited my counselor about this. She did absolutely nothing but humiliate the kid by calling him down while I was still seated with her and making him confess to follow me my group around while I was at lunch. Very creepy if you ask me. He had been trying to catch me alone, which was why I always walked with friends. I'd been trying to avoid him drawing me while I was sleeping, having suicidal tendencies and crushing things out of anger whenever he was mildly upset. He would break mechanical pencils, erasers, paper, etc. After that, she made him admit to having obsessive behavior. Get ready for this. He told me that most of his passwords were my name. He wrote my name over and over, and then I was the subject of many short stories he wrote. Yeah, I'm flattered. Sarcasm, but no thanks. Fortunately, this was nearing the end of school, so I was able to ignore him. Until then, I was feeling really guilty and scared the whole time. I hadn't meant to cause him so much stress and trauma, and what if I'd triggered a suicide response? This year, however, I have no classes with him at all, so maybe the counselor was good for something. He is doing fine. I often see him in the halls, and he seems to be spending time with a girl I used to know. She has a similar disposition. This could be good for both of them, I guess, but to me he was definitely the creepiest kid I've ever encountered. I'm a 26-year-old woman, and last winter I was waiting outside my local food pantry to collect some food for my family when this older guy was maybe 50 to 60, pulled up next to me in a truck. I was minding my own business reading a book in my car because the place didn't open for another 10 to 15 minutes, and it was December, so it was freezing. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the guy is waving for my attention, motioning me to put my window down. The window in my car didn't work, so I opened the door to see what he wanted. This guy started asking me a barrage of questions that got increasingly weirder given the situation. He started off asking if I was there to pick fruit up. I said, yeah. He asked if I lived in town. Yes. He asked where I worked. I wasn't working. He asked where I lived. I did tell him. He asked if I lived alone. I lived with family. He asked if I had a boyfriend/husband. Yes, my boyfriend. He told me where he lived and even gave me his full address and directions for how to get there from where we were. I didn't ask. He then asked me if I would drive to his place after I collected my food. He said something about wanting to see if he could use anything I might not want. Now, I know this might have just been an older guy hoping for a little extra food for the winter, but the whole situation was so weird and creepy to me. There was the guy who was asking a woman at least half his age a ton of personal questions, keeping her standing in freezing weather, and then asked her to come to accompany to his house. I finally just said I was freezing standing there and got back in my car. I still had about a 5-minute wait, and I tried to just focus on my book, but I could see the guy watching me through in the corner of my eye. I was really glad to get my food and get out of there. There's this dude that goes to my college and is in a few clubs with me. I've had a few really not great encounters with him, and his vibe is so rancid. A year or so ago, we had a fancy party where everyone in the club got dressed up. I wore a really pretty floor-length dress. We all were getting tipsy and having a great time until a few of us went out onto the porch. A friend of mine had a bit too much, so I was comforting him. A creepy guy comes up behind me and starts talking about how no one will ever love him. He takes the end of my dress and starts crying into it. It made me really uncomfortable because I honestly don't know the guy, and I didn't really want him hugging my dress closer and closer to his body. I had to snatch my dress away from him, and I left with my friend. This isn't the first time this has happened either. Thanks for listening. The subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more things you don't want to know. Let us know in the comments what you think about these stories.